Now that I've gone over the brain anatomy as well as states of mind, I'd like to link this back to what implications it has for learning and how a child learns. There are three key concepts that I want to outline. First is stress and how it relates to learning. Second is connections and context. And last is using the whole brain. The first thing I want to talk about is stress. And one thing I want to point out initially is that there are different types of stress, and the body registers and uses these different types of stress differently to make decisions about how it's going to behave. The two types of stress in general are called eustress, which is conducive to learning and is a positive stressful state, and distress, where the organism perceives a threat. And at this point, obviously, the lower and midbrain will take over and influence learning. So the cognitive or neocortex is inhibited when the organism experiences distress. And just a quick comment, what is a threat? A threat is anything that triggers a sense of helplessness in the individual. And this is important when we consider the learning environment that children are put in. So just to elaborate a little bit further, eustress is perceived as a challenge or a problem that we can resolve. So we feel like we have a sense of control. So we may have a stressor, and the stressor is not the actual key element here. It's actually the notion of how the child perceives the stressor, whether they feel they have control over that stressor or not. Compared to, again, distress, where the challenge or problem is we can't resolve, we're helpless to it. We don't have control over the situation. What happens when an organism or a child experiences distress is we go into what's called downshifting. So the lower and midbrain take over in order to keep the organism safe from dealing with the stress that they perceive as a threat to its survival. Positive stress is a stimulated but not overly stimulated state. And this is what we want to achieve with children. So the notion of having a challenge is a very important part of encouraging learning in children. So just to comment again, the more threatened and helpless children feel, the less likely they are to learn. So to link back to how this relates to learning, parents can support their children's learning by shifting a stressor, something that's perceived as distress, a negative stress, potentially completing a science project that the child finds is overwhelming and doesn't know where to start, to a positive stress by helping the child work through the task, break it down into key components, create a positive environment with the child, make sure that you're affirming the child in terms of we can do this, I can help you, giving the child a sense of control over the project. So go through the assignment with the child. If there's questions around the assignment, write them down and support your child to ask their teacher the next school day. Things that allow the child to decrease their stress level, feel like they have some control, as well as feel like they have the support of a significant adult to help them work through the stressful learning experience. We can also create a positive atmosphere during homework time. So as I mentioned, if appropriate, work with your child and create a positive tone. It can't be underestimated the impact that we have as modelers of enthusiastic, intrinsically motivated learners. So if we are motivated and interested in what the child is learning, they're likely to be motivated and interested as well. Another concept around stress and learning that's important to point out is the notion of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation are rewards or punishments for a certain behavior. So children may be rewarded for learning something by being bought a treat. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is motivation that's inside the individual, taking personal pride in one's work, having personal standards about the quality of a work. Why this is important is that rewards are actually, because they're external to the individual, they can become a controlling factor in how the child learns, resulting in somewhat a sense of helplessness around the learning. So the child now perceives that they must do a task and they must learn it to a certain level for this reward, and that actually decreases their chance of feeling in control of the learning experience. They are less likely to take ownership for it because of the rewards that are being given to them externally. The other problem with rewards is that it can result in a learner focusing very specifically on a task at hand and just completing it so that they get the reward that they're seeking. And they can ignore other information that may be valid and potentially that the teacher never even thought is relevant to the task that could actually enrich the learning experience. So again, by controlling the learning through a reward, children will be very focused and have somewhat tunnel vision around what they're learning and not look to the sort of the larger environment in terms of how they learn and what they choose to learn. The next implication for learning related to the brain is the notion of making connections and have the learning being in context. As I mentioned before, we cannot separate what is being learned from, certainly in terms of one area of the brain to another, as well as the environment in which the child is learning. So as I mentioned, our brain is always seeking to perceive patterns. It wants to take what's going on in the world and make sense based on previous patterns that we've got internalized already. So when educators and parents are working with children to help them learn, it's important that they help the children perceive patterns, link the learning and what is being learned to what's already meaningful to the child, and truly immerse the child in the learning. So allowing children to talk about what they're doing, the teacher using the appropriate vocabulary to support learning and talk about the learning themselves, parents speaking with the children at dinner about what they're learning and bringing it into the larger context. Any way that we can embed the learning into the reality of the child and create a positive atmosphere around the learning will encourage students to learn more effectively. The last point around connections and context is that through creating connections and putting the learning in context and bringing it into the reality of the learning develops some meaning. So what the child has learned becomes meaningful to them. And this makes it more likely for them to not only learn it more effectively initially, but be able to access it later on in life. The last implication of learning in terms of brain functioning is to never forget that the whole brain is working all the time to either support or inhibit learning. So this will be a bit of a summary of what I've gone over, but we need to keep in mind that the emotional state of the child and the emotional environment is key to helping the student learn. So when we think about whole brain learning, it's important that the child feels safe and the environment that the child is in when they're learning is a safe one. Additionally, as I mentioned before, ritual and routine are important in terms of us also feeling safe. So we are a routine animal. Our lower brain, if our routines get changed without appropriate preparation, can initiate a stress response, and that can inhibit learning. So it's important, if routines are developed that are positive, that they're maintained as much as possible. Also, we need to encourage forethought. So giving children an opportunity to visualize and imagine and to think about the learning and what they're learning through different parts of their brain is a really important concept to help students learn more effectively. Finally, it's important to provide opportunities for the children to shift their brainwave activities throughout the day, having opportunities for meditation, exercise, as well as in the evening, sufficient sleep, and then rest throughout the day is important to keep our brain functioning appropriately. So in summary, very quickly, the most important concepts to take out of this talk are that in order for learning to occur most effectively, it's essential that a positive, safe environment is created for the child. This allows the lower and middle brain to be supportive of the upper brain as it engages in learning new information. If there is stress, it's important to have it be eustress. So if a project or a learning opportunity is experienced as distressful as a threat, it's important that it be shifted to a eustress experience where the child feels like they have control over the learning experience. Secondly, state of arousal is key. The most conducive state of arousal to learning is relaxed alertness. However, the brain cannot stay in this state for long periods of time, so we must allow children to shift from one wavelength state to another. Lastly, the notion of context and connections cannot be ignored for effective learning to occur. The best way for a child to learn information is through being immersed in it, through having it linked to the reality of the child as well as the reality of the world around them. These three key elements are essential to support children to learn effectively and develop as productive individuals in our society.